In the 1920s and 1930s, Leon Trotsky chose to pose a question as a title for several of his greatest essays on then unfolding political events. The most famous of these essays were Where is Britain Going?, written in 1925, just 1 year before the eruption of the British General Strike, Towards Socialism or Capitalism, also written in 1925, which dealt with critical questions related to the economic policies of the new Soviet state, and Whither France, written in 1934, as the country was entering a period of intense class conflict. Tonight's lecture poses the question, where is America going? I think that most people, if asked, would respond rather quickly with the answer, to hell. And if only meant metaphorically, the answer would be justified. But there is more involved. There is a widespread belief, not only within the United States, but throughout the world, that America is a very sick country, and that this sickness will have terrible consequences for the entire world. There is an old adage, when America sneezes, the world catches a cold. But it now acquires new and frightening global implications. Because what is happening in the United States today is much worse than a sneeze. What the world is witnessing is an historically unprecedented breakdown of American democracy, of which the grotesque figure of Donald Trump is only a surface manifestation. To understand the crisis, its causes and consequences, it is necessary to go beyond the appearance and penetrate beneath the surface and examine the deeper economic and social roots. Only by understanding this deeper analysis and linking Trump to the social milieu from which he emerged, the class interests he represents, the crisis of the capitalist system, the massive contradictions of American society, and the global challenges confronting U.S. imperialism, can one explain why the government of the United States has been placed by its ruling elites in the hands of a sociopathic criminal? There is a justly celebrated passage in Marx's account of the class struggles in France, written in 1850, in which he described the bourgeois elite that ruled the country during the reign of Louis Philippe on the eve of the 1848 revolution. He wrote, clashing every moment with the bourgeois laws themselves, an unbridled assertion of unhealthy and dissolute appetites manifested itself, particularly at the top of bourgeois society. Lusts, wherein wealth derived from gambling naturally seeks its satisfaction, where pleasure becomes crapuleux, debauched, where money, filth, and blood commingle. The finance aristocracy, in its mode of acquisition as well as in its pleasure, is nothing but the rebirth of the lumpen proletariat at the summit of bourgeois society. Taking that passage as an example, and thinking what Marx would write if he were alive today, he might have said the following about the present regime in the United States. The Wall Street oligarchy and its corporate allies pervert the law, stack the government, and shape public opinion through a corrupt media that distorts and conceals social reality. Criminal swindling, thinly disguised graft, and wild obsession with personal wealth infect every layer of the elite, from the White House, the Congress, judiciary, the corporate boardrooms, to the prestigious citadels of academia. The accumulations of billions is derived not from production, but from speculation, the manipulation of debt, the plundering of social resources, and the impoverishment of the broad mass of the population. The oligarchy's insatiable greed and lust for self-gratification collides not only with bourgeois law, but also with the most basic moral precepts. From the White House and the Mar-a-Lago brothel to mega-million-dollar estates, perverse and predatory appetites reign unchecked. Billionaires and high-placed politicians welcome to the services of child sex traffickers like Epstein, deriving pleasure from the raw exploitation of the helpless. In these circles, money, depravity, and violence are inseparable. Trump's so-called art of the deal is the modus operandi of the capitalist class, encompassing every form of corporate and government criminality. Amassing profits from the sale of aircraft and missiles used in the genocidal assault on Gaza, the murder of unidentified fishermen in international waters off the coast of Venezuela, the illegal deployment of military forces in U.S. cities, and the seizure and deportation by ICE agents, America's version of Nacht und Nebel, in violation of all legal rights from the United States. The financial corporate oligarchy, in its business operations as well as in its orgies, is nothing but a super mafia at the summit of capitalist society, flaunting crime and perversion while ordinary people pay the cost in misery, poverty, and blood. Following the second election of Trump in November 2024, exactly 1 year ago, the World Socialist Web Site warned that the repeated threats to rule as a dictator were not merely an expression of Trump's desire to emulate his personal hero, Adolf Hitler. Rather, these threats anticipated the restructuring of American politics based on its real class structure. The massive concentration of wealth in an infinitesimal fraction of American society is not compatible with traditional forms of bourgeois rule. The political structure of the United States is now being brought into alignment with its class structure. The most basic feature of American society is its staggering level of social inequality. Any serious discussion of American reality that avoids this issue is as intellectually worthless and politically fraudulent as a discussion of the politics of ancient Rome that failed to mention slavery. The term oligarchy is not employed as a rhetorical flourish. It is an appropriate description of the concentration of massive wealth and power in the United States. On November 3rd, the humanitarian organization Oxfam published a report titled Unequal: The Rise of a New American Oligarchy and the Agenda We Need. It doesn't really provide an agenda, but it did provide very significant facts. Among its key findings are, as you can see, the wealthiest 0.1% in the U.S. own 12.6% of assets and 24% of the stock market. Between 1989 and 2022, a U.S. household at the 99th percentile gained 101 times more wealth than the median household and 987 times more wealth than a household at the 20th percentile. Over 40% of the U.S. population including 48.9% of children, is considered poor or low income. The Oxfam report states, in the past year alone, the 10 richest billionaires got $698 billion richer. Since 2020, their inflation-adjusted wealth is up 526%. The richest 0.0001%, 1 in a million, control a greater share of wealth than in the Gilded Age, that is a period of the 1880s, 1890s, the first decade of the 20th century, which was defined by extreme inequality. The richest 1% own half of the stock market, 49.9%, while the bottom half of the U.S. owns just 1% of the stock market. The report exposes the claim that the great mass of working-class Americans participate in the country's wealth. It writes, despite notions of the U.S. as an exceptionally prosperous society, international comparisons illustrate a different reality. Looking at the 16 largest OECD economies, the U.S. has the highest rate of relative poverty, the second highest rate of child poverty and infant mortality, and the second lowest life expectancy. These poor outcomes may seem surprising, but are consistent with the country's outlier status on social policy. Within the same group of peer countries, the U.S. is dead last in generosity of unemployment benefits, second to last in public spending for families and children, 7th out of 10 in public social spending for families with children, 7th out of 10 in public social spending overall, and number 1 for working hours needed to exit poverty. Of the 10 largest OECD countries, the U.S. tax and transfer system ranks second to last in reducing inequality. The extreme concentration of wealth is inseparable from oligarchic political power. Trump's cabinet and top appointees possess a collected net worth exceeding $60 billion. The administration's wealth dwarfs all predecessors. 16 of Trump's 25 wealthiest appointees rank among the 813 billionaires in a nation of 341 million people, placing them in the top 0.0001%. This is not symbolic representation, it is direct rule by the oligarchy. Now, it is a characteristic of every ruling class that as it heads for extinction, it becomes increasingly aggressive. The more irrational its system becomes, the more violent the efforts to legitimize it. A parallel for this can be found in the decades preceding the French Revolution. As the nobility sought to reassert lost privileges and defend threatened prerogatives, it became ever more extreme and intransigent in its methods. The so-called aristocratic offensive of the 1760s through 1789 was not a defensive reaction, but an aggressive attempt to reverse the historic erosion of feudal privilege. And as the aristocracy sensed its ultimate doom, its desperation manifested itself in ever more violent assertions of power. This process came to a head with the eruption of revolution in July 1789. In the decades preceding the Second American Revolution of 1861 to 65, the slave owners of the South sought to illegalize and stamp out every form of opposition to slavery. In a manner similar to the operation of ICE agents today against immigrants, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 empowered federal agents to seize runaway slaves who had fled to the North and return them to their masters. In 1857, the Supreme Court controlled by the slave power, declared that slaves were merely property and were not protected by the laws that apply to citizens and human beings. Finally, refusing to accept the election of Abraham Lincoln as president, the tyrants of the South began an insurrection against the United States in 1861. The Confederate States of America proclaimed slavery as the essential foundation of civilization. A bloody civil war, which cost more than 700,000 lives, was required to suppress the rebellion and abolish slavery. A similar process of political reaction and historical retrogression is underway today in the United States. The display of oligarchic power has become increasingly brazen, hostile to the forms of democratic legitimacy that have provided capitalist rule with at least a veneer of popular consent. Glorifying the legacy of slavery, Trump has ordered that the statues of Confederate military leaders, which have been removed from public places and military bases, be reassembled. The old battle cry of pro-Confederate racists, "The South shall rise again," has become the policy of the U.S. government. Consider the spectacle staged in early September at the White House. Virtually the entire leadership of the technology oligarchy, including Bill Gates of Microsoft, Tim Cook of Apple, Sam Altman of OpenAI, Sergey Brin of Google, Mark Zuckerberg of Meta, and other billionaires and corporate executives paraded through the presidential residence, their presence signifying the complete subordination of formal governmental authority to financial and corporate power. This was not a private meeting. It was a public coronation. The President of the United States functions as the most vulgar representative of a parasitic oligarchy. And then, not long after, an even more extraordinary spectacle. Trump and scores of billionaires and corporate executives dined at Windsor Castle with the King of England. To give an indication of the levels of wealth they embodied, the combined personal wealth of 24 of the richest at the table was $274 billion. The average figure per person of $11.4 billion is over 67,000 times the wealth of the median British citizen. Between them, they represented companies with a market capitalization of $17.7 trillion, more than the combined value of every publicly listed company incorporated in the United Kingdom. The royal family itself is poor by the standards of its guests, holding barely 0.33% of the personal wealth of these 24 people. But what the royalty brings to the table is a long history of inherited privilege, a tradition of centuries of rule and luxury, which the new financial and corporate aristocracy finds deeply attractive and wishes to emulate. Meanwhile, on American soil, Trump is constructing a monument to oligarchic power that surpasses all historical precedent. The entire executive residence of the White House, the central building that houses the president and serves as the primary ceremonial space, comprises approximately 55,000 square feet. Trump's new ballroom, financed by billionaire donors and major corporations, will span 90,000 square feet, nearly double the size of the White House itself. The White House is being turned into a palace. This is a construction of a Versailles on the Potomac River, a brazen assertion of oligarchic supremacy. The old residence is also being refurbished. Trump has proudly posted photos of a redecorated bathroom that was once used by Lincoln. It now features a golden toilet seat upon which Trump can plant his posterior while he ponders and plans new crimes. Taken as a whole, the actions of the Trump administration are an attempt to impose archaic forms of rule, hierarchical, authoritarian, explicitly anti-democratic, upon a mass society characterized by vast productive capacity, advanced technology, instantaneous global communications, and the organizational potential of billions of workers integrated into a world economy. This anachronism, the fusion of ancient forms of despotic oligarchy with the technological and productive apparatus of a world economy, creates contradictions of extraordinary intensity. The unfolding counter-revolution in politics is inevitably justified by a counter-revolution in thought. The infamous Dark Enlightenment, with its explicit invocation of a corporate-based monarchy, is an attempt to provide philosophical justification for this reversion to despotism, dressed in the language of contemporary technological rationality. Peter Thiel, the founder of PayPal and a patron of Vice President J.D. Vance and countless other fascistic politicians, wrote in 2009, and I quote, "Most importantly, I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible." Another leading philosopher of the Dark Enlightenment, Curtis Yarvin, has proposed that government be structured as a corporation with a CEO monarch wielding absolute authority. The question is, are we witnessing merely a disgusting and irrational set of actions of manic individuals driven by unlimited greed and hunger for power? Or is there a deeper objective basis for this phenomena rooted in the inner laws of capitalist accumulation? A correct answer to this question is essential, because a critique of capitalism based only on moral outrage, however justified that outrage may be, cannot provide the foundation for a revolutionary struggle against it. Not in America and not in Germany. There have been innumerable mass demonstrations against the Gaza genocide. But what has been totally absent from these demonstrations is a realistic political perspective and program based on a scientific understanding of the relationship between the genocide and the existing capitalist imperialist system. In the absence of such an analysis, the protests became an appeal to the imperialist governments and corporations, the sponsors and defenders of Israel, to withdraw their support for genocide. One might ask, as Trotsky once said, how is that better than praying for rain? An article published on November 12th in the Wall Street Journal exposes the futilities of such appeals to the corporations. Titled, "The Gaza War Has Been Big Business for U.S. Companies," it reports, and I quote, "The conflict built an unprecedented arms pipeline from the United States to Israel that continues to flow, generating substantial business for big U.S. companies, including Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and Caterpillar. Sales of U.S. weapons to Israel have surged since October 2023, with Washington approving more than $32 billion in armaments, ammunitions, and other equipment to the Israeli military over time, according to a Wall Street Journal analysis of State Department disclosures." Moral outrage provides no effective direction for political actions. Rather, the failure of moral appeals to the ruling class generally leads to disappointment, pessimism, and demoralization. Moreover, and no less fatal to a genuinely revolutionary perspective, it leads to a vast exaggeration of the power of the ruling elites. The contradictions that are embedded in the capitalist system and which create the conditions for a revolutionary explosion are not seen. And the greatest error of all, the central role of the working class in the struggle against capitalism is ignored and even rejected. That, by the way, sums up the entire legacy of the Frankfurt School. The crimes and brutalities of the ruling class are not simply symptoms of their bad character. They reflect the desperate struggles of a system to overcome its internal contradictions. The violence of the oligarchy, the brazenness of its power grabs, the descent into authoritarianism, all of these express the terminal crisis of the capitalist mode of production itself. Let me try to explain this. In recent years, the term financialization has come into common usage as a description of an essential change in the structure of U.S. and world capitalist economy. It denotes the ever more extreme detachment of the generation of profits and wealth from the process of production and exchange. Corporations realize a large portion of their profits through financial transactions, trading securities, lending, and all manner of speculative investments. The principal feature of financialization include the growth of banks and institutional investors relative to the real productive economy, the proliferation of complex financial instruments, derivatives, securitized loans, etc., and the vast expansion of credit and debt. Inseparably connected with the process of financialization is the massive growth of fictitious capital. That is, claims on future wealth out of all proportion to or independent of the current productive economy. A share of stock is a claim on future profits that have not yet and may never be realized in production and exchange. Between 2000 and 2020, for every $1 of net new investment in the real economy, about $4 in financial liabilities were created. Thus, the process of financialization and the growth of fictitious capital creates over time an economy that more and more resembles a Ponzi scheme, where investors rely on continually rising asset values. Little attention is paid to whether the stock market valuation of a company's assets bears any relation to the real earnings based on the production and sale of goods and services. Systemically, this has created a world of illusory wealth. The total gross domestic product of the United States is estimated to be between $30 and $30.5 trillion. But the total market capitalization of U.S. listed companies reached approximately $69 to $71 trillion by October of this year. The total value of all publicly traded U.S. stocks is therefore more than double, 220%, the size of annual U.S. economic output. This is a historical reversal of the relationship of the stock market to the U.S. economy. In 1971, total market capitalization equaled approximately 80% of the GDP, about 1/4 of what it is today. This means that over the last 50 years, the value of financial assets has grown much faster than the underlying production of goods and services. Financial wealth and speculative capital has become untethered from the real economy. This unsustainable relationship between the nominal value of the market is not only economically unsustainable, or to use the famous phrase of Alan Greenspan, a sign of irrational exuberance, it is a manifestation of the historical decline and breakdown of U.S. capitalism. In fact, the year 1971 is important. In its historical context, That year marked a fundamental watershed in the economic trajectory of American capitalism. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the convertibility of the dollar into gold at the rate of $35 per ounce, which had been established at the Bretton Woods Economic Conference of 1944 and which had served as the foundation of the post-World War II restabilization and growth of the world capitalist economy. The basis of dollar-gold convertibility was the overwhelming productive power and dominant role of American capitalism. The huge balance of trade and payment surpluses of the U.S. underlay its pledge to redeem dollars held by foreign countries with gold. But in the course of the 1950s and 1960s, as Europe and Japan rebuilt their war-shattered economies, the dominance of the United States steadily declined. As its trade surpluses steadily shrank, its commitment to dollar-gold convertibility became increasingly unviable. Fearing a run on the dollar and the depletion of its gold reserves, Nixon repudiated the agreements reached at Bretton Woods in 1944. This decision generated global economic shockwaves. The price of oil, measured in dollars, quadrupled. The dollar underwent a massive devaluation, a process which has continued for the last half-century. The rise of gold from $35 an ounce in 1971 to over $4,000 an ounce represents a de facto objective measure of the long-term collapse in the real value of the US dollar. The more than 100-fold increase is therefore not an expression of gold becoming intrinsically more valuable, but of the dollar losing purchasing power and credibility. If one takes gold as a proxy for the general price level over decades, a 100-fold increase implies a comparable erosion, roughly 99% of the dollar's real value. Few other indicators so starkly capture the cumulative effect of inflation, monetary expansion, and persistent debt monetization since the end of the Bretton Woods system. As a measure of its global economic position, the end of dollar-gold convertibility was a manifestation of crisis. However, a consequence of the decision was the removal of all economically rational restraint on the accumulation of debts and deficits. It was, you might say, a monetary pact with the economic devil. The United States could cover its debts and deficits by the limitless printing of dollars. Since 1971, the U.S. has financed deficits through expanding credit and, in recent decades, through unprecedented quantitative easing. The explosive rise in federal debt from $400 billion in 1971 to $38 trillion today underscores the degree to which the dollar is sustained not by convertibility, but merely by a global demand for dollar assets, a demand which is now under visible strain. The gold price functions as an international referendum on the credibility of U.S. monetary policy. A rise from $35 to $4,000 represents broad, long-term hedging against dollar debasement. The decline in the dollar's share of global reserves, the diversification into gold by central banks, and the growth of non-dollar trade arrangements all align with this trend. Such a dramatic revaluation signifies not merely inflation, but a historic disintegration of the dollar's value function. It expresses the same underlying contradictions: permanent trade deficits, deindustrialization, debt dependence, financialization, that now drive the broader decline of U.S. global hegemony. Above all, the decline of the dollar is not only a monetary phenomenon. Over the past 5 decades, the erosion of U.S. economic and geopolitical hegemony has assumed a cumulative, systemic character. The most visible index is the collapse of the country's external financial position. Since the early 1990s, the United States has recorded uninterrupted and ever-widening trade deficits. The annual goods deficit, roughly $100 billion in 1990, now exceeds $1 trillion. This chronic imbalance expresses the hollowing out of the country's industrial base and its reliance on global financial inflows to sustain consumption and asset bubbles. The U.S. net international investment position, positive as late as the early 1980s, has plunged to more than $18 trillion, the largest debtor position in world history. I know these figures are staggering. They may be hard to comprehend, but what I am describing, based on these figures, is in fact an unfolding economic disintegration of the United States. And believe me, within a very short time, what I am describing will become a reality so extreme that it's going to have catastrophic effects on the living standards of hundreds of millions, indeed billions of people. The United States is drowning in debt. 50 years ago, in 1975, in the aftermath of the collapse of Bretton Woods and at the outset of the financialization process, the national debt stood at $533 billion. That's a substantial number. By 1985, it had tripled to $1.8 trillion. In 2005, the national debt was $7.9 trillion. Following the bailout of Wall Street by the Federal Reserve in response to the crash of 2008, the national debt exploded. By 2015, it had reached $18.1 trillion. In 2020, following yet another bailout of Wall Street, in the midst of the COVID crisis, the debt reached $27 trillion. As of 2025, the national debt stands at $38 trillion. Thus, in the space of a half century, the national debt has grown by approximately 6,000%. During the same period, the GDP grew by only 1,321%. This means that the national debt has grown 5 times more than the total market value of all final goods and services produced by the United States. To take a shorter time frame, in the space of a quarter century, since 2000, the GDP grew approximately 187%, while the national debt grew 566%. Now, public debt, government debt, is not the full story. Let us consider the rise in personal debt. In 1970, which is a measure of the conditions, the real living conditions of broad mass of the population. In 1975, personal debt totaled $500 billion. As of the third quarter of this year, the total size of all forms of personal debt, which includes mortgages, credit card debt, auto loans, student loans, and home equity lines of credit, stands at $18.59 trillion. This is a 36-fold increase. During the same period, the annual income of the bottom 90% of Americans has stagnated. The debt of the overwhelming majority of Americans is approximately 1/3 of their total household wealth. The ratio of debt to household wealth is substantially greater for the bottom half of the population. Between 2020 and 2024, a total of 4 or 5 million Americans filed for bankruptcy. As of September, 374,000 Americans filed for bankruptcy. By the end of this year, the total number of bankruptcies will exceed that of the 2024 number. According to the most recent figures, approximately 75% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. This means that they have little or no money to cover emergencies should they arise. Tens of millions of Americans live on the brink of destitution. Dickens' famous description of France on the eve of the French Revolution as the best of times and the worst of times applies to present-day America and, in fact, to the world. While most Americans are living in various degrees of economic distress, an infinitesimal fraction have a level of wealth for which there is no precedent in the modern age or even perhaps in world history. The total wealth of the mega billionaires has been so widely reported that it is not necessary to review them in this report. Suffice it to say that after the announcement of Elon Musk's $1 trillion pay packet, one is not surprised to read that the personal wealth of Larry Ellison, the head of Oracle, increased by $100 billion in a single day. However, what must be stressed is that the astronomical scale of the fortunes of the oligarchs is inextricably linked to the financialization of the U.S. and global economy. Their personal wealth is built upon a mountain of fictitious capital. They are the embodiment of financial parasitism, deriving wealth not from the production of real value, but through the inflation of claims on value. They owe their riches to asset price inflation, leveraging, share buybacks, mergers and acquisitions, debt securitization, and derivatives and arbitrage. The legalization and success of these operations is assured by the collaboration of presidents, congressmen and congresswomen, judges and government administrators who the oligarchs buy and bribe. Now again, referring to the French Revolution, when you study the history and you learn of the debts of feudal France, the extravagant spending, the useless lifestyles, the ostentatious displays of the aristocracy, one accepts, yes, revolution was inevitable. It had to come to pass. How could it not be avoided? But on a historical scale, what we're witnessing today surpasses by far even the profligacy of that era. The wealth of today's super rich has a malignant and socially criminal character, as the processes and policies which sustain it require not only the impoverishment of billions of people, but also endless war for the control of markets and critical resources and ecological disaster. Presently, as Tamino has mentioned, the United States, the Trump administration, is considering war against Venezuela. And the New York Times reports that what Trump is talking about when he speaks of Venezuela is Venezuela's oil resources. That's what he wants. The methods of the mafia, stealing, killing, plunder, this is what arises from the conditions of American capitalism. The statistics I have cited, and a far longer list could be presented, are unanswerable factual demonstrations of the socially regressive, reactionary, and criminal character of modern capitalism. But the question still arises, do these facts demonstrate the historical breakdown of the capitalist system? Or to put the question somewhat differently, is the rising mass opposition to capitalism only an outraged response to social inequality? Or is it, in a more profound historical sense, an objective manifestation in the sphere of politics of a revolutionary solution to economic contradictions that are not solvable within the framework of the capitalist system. And here I must come to perhaps the most complicated yet critical element of this lecture. The answer to this question requires that one review and work through the implications in the context of the present-day financialization of the U.S. and world economy, Marx's analysis of the value form, and his discovery and explanation of the declining rate of profit. Now, we all know that since 1991, especially since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it has been endlessly proclaimed that Marx is irrelevant, Marxism is irrelevant, capitalism has triumphed. But this propaganda proclamation does not, in fact, end the operation of the law of value as it was first analyzed by Marx in Das Kapital. Marx's analysis of the value form and discovery of an explanation of the declining rate of profit remains fundamental for an understanding of the present-day reality. Value, as Marx explained in Volume 1 of Capital, is not a thing. It is rather a social relationship which finds expression in the process of production. In the capitalist system, value is created by the labor power expended by workers. Profit is derived through the purchase of labor power by the capitalist class, which in the course of its utilization produces a greater amount of value than the wage that the worker received for the sale of his labor power to the capitalist. In his analysis of the labor process, Marx identified the two components of capital: variable capital, which is the value invested in labor power, and constant capital, which is all non-human inputs into the production process, including raw materials, machinery, tools, and buildings required to produce a commodity. While constant capital transfers its value to the product, variable capital, the labor power expended by the worker, produces surplus value, from which profit is ultimately derived. The rate of profit was defined by Marx as the ratio of surplus value generated by variable capital to the total capital expended in the process of production. As the productive forces grow, the ratio of constant capital, the entire infrastructure of production, the relationship of constant capital to variable capital increases. The result is a decline in the rate of profit. This law-governed process is a source of instability and crisis in the capitalist system. However, the necessary effort of the capitalist class to counteract this decline in the rate of profit is the driving force of technological innovation aimed at increasing the efficiency of labor power in producing surplus value. The countervailing factors mitigating against the decline in the rate of profit include the expansion of trade, the acquisition of new sources of cheap labor, and, as we have reviewed, an increasing reliance on credit and debt to artificially increase profits, even as the underlying ratio between constant and variable capital grows increasingly unfavorable. Now, within this context, we have to understand the significance and implications of the frenzy on Wall Street generated by the growth of artificial intelligence, AI, and associated automated technologies. It seems to be the realization of the dream of every corporate CEO. They have found a way of drastically lowering labor costs. And in fact, corporations within the United States and internationally are in the process of implementing massive jobs cuts. Across industries from logistics to auto manufacturing, to aerospace, to telecom, to banking, firms are implementing massive AI systems that eliminate clerical roles, customer support, coding, financial modeling, and thousands of other positions that formerly provided employment. In Germany alone, Siemens has eliminated 5,600 industrial automation jobs. Lufthansa, 4,000 administrative roles. CF Friedrichshafen faces 7,600 to 14,000 job losses tied to automation. Telefonica is cutting 6,000 to 7,000 jobs amid AI restructuring. Across the United States, Amazon has cut 14,000 corporate roles. UPS has eliminated 48,000 jobs through automated hubs. Salesforce has replaced 4,000 customer service workers with AI agents. However, and this is the critical issue, whatever short-term increases in profitability that are achieved, the net effect of the vast displacement of human labor, the source of surplus value, is an accelerated rise in the ratio of constant to variable capital, and therefore a decline in the rate of profit systemically. This process intensifies to a level of unprecedented scale the basic contradiction of capitalism identified by Marx. The scale of surplus value becomes insufficient to the mass of capital requiring valorization. Profits cannot expand at the pace necessary to sustain the accumulating constant capital. The entire system is increasingly destabilized. Devaluation of capital through bankruptcies, liquidations, write-down and destruction of fixed capital, and finally wars, is a desperate response to the crisis of profitability. Even amid the speculative frenzy unleashed by AI, concern is being raised about the socially devastating consequences of implementing this new technology, as well as its economic viability. In an article published in the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs, the most authoritative publication of the policy-making elite, there is an article titled "The Stagnant Order" by Professor Michael Beckley, and he writes, "Some forecasts claim that artificial intelligence will turbocharge global output by 30% per year. But most economists expect it will add only 1 percentage point to annual growth. AI exceeds at digital tasks, yet the toughest labor bottlenecks are in physical and social realms. Hospitals need nurses more than they need faster scans. Restaurants need cooks more than ordering tablets. Lawyers must persuade judges, not just parse briefs. Robots remain clumsy in real-world settings, and because machine learning is probabilistic, errors are inevitable. So humans must often stay in the loop. Reflecting these limits, roughly 80% of firms using generative AI reported that it had no material effect on their profits. Even if AI keeps advancing, major productivity gains may take decades because economies must reorganize around new tools. That offers little relief for today's economies. Global growth has slowed from 4% in the first decade of the 21st century, to about 3% today, and to barely 1% in advanced economies. Productivity growth, which ran at 3 to 4% annually in the 1950s and 1960s, has fallen close to zero. Meanwhile, global debt has swollen from 200% of GDP 15 years ago to 250%, topping 300% in some advanced countries. The conclusions drawn by Professor Beckley are bleak. The United States is becoming a rogue superpower the phrase leader of the free world rings hollow even to American ears. What looms is not a multipolar concert of great powers sharing the world, but a reprise of some of the worst aspects of the 20th century. Struggling states militarizing, fragile ones collapsing, democracies rotting from within, and the supposed guarantor of order retreating into parochial self-interest. In other words, AI is not the savior of capitalism. Rather, it magnifies to an extraordinary degree the contradictions that already exist. The enormous mass of constant capital required for AI infrastructure confront a vastly reduced supply of living labor, variable capital, to generate surplus value. This is not a contradiction that can be overcome within capitalism. Facing this predicament, the ruling class seeks to counteract the crisis through ever more violent processes, attacks on working conditions, the evisceration of social programs, mass deportation programs, war, and genocide. The oligarchy, cornered by its own internal contradictions, lashes out with increasing desperation. The militarization of American cities, the support for fascism, the promotion of war against Russia and China. These are not rational policy choices. They are the convulsions of a dying system. The selection of a crude gangster as president, the political equivalent of Tony Soprano, testifies to the putrefaction of the American ruling class. You are familiar with this process in German history. As you all know, in 1933, Adolf Hitler was essentially hired by a small elite of capitalists who met and decided, without any official electoral authorization, to place Adolf Hitler in power. Donald Trump is simply an instrument chosen precisely because of what he is. The measures required by American capitalism to deal with the crisis I've been describing require, in fact, criminal methods, the methods of a mafia thug. And that is what Trump essentially is. In this lecture, I have focused on the objective conditions and processes that have created a crisis that cannot be solved on a progressive basis other than through socialist revolution. Moreover, the rapidly deteriorating conditions of life for the great majority of Americans is already producing a growing sentiment that an alternative to capitalism is necessary. This sentiment has found initial expression in the election of Zohran Mamdani as mayor of New York City, the financial citadel of world capitalism. Of course, Mamdani is no more a socialist than former German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. But the political significance of his election in a country which has been ruled for 150 years by a capitalist two-party system of Democrats and Republicans cannot be denied. Trump immediately responded to Mamdani's election by announcing the public observance of what he called Anti-Communism Week. However, the existence of an extreme crisis does not guarantee the overthrow of capitalism. Socialism is not simply the product of the working out of objective laws. The declining rate of profit does not lead automatically to the end of the capitalist system. The deeper the crisis, the more violent and ruthless will be the efforts of the ruling class to save its system, even at the cost of the destruction of civilization. The ruling class does not say, the Marxists are right, we are suffering from the declining rate of profit, we must give up power. No, they will do everything in their power to utilize their control of the military, the police, all the other instruments of repression to retain that power. So in the final analysis, the overthrow of capitalism depends upon the conscious struggle of the working class for socialism. Objective processes create both the necessity and conditions for the overthrow of capitalism, but the socialist revolution is the outcome of an enormous growth in the socialist consciousness of the masses and their conscious intervention in the historical process. Now, is this possible? The history of the 20th century was dominated by revolutionary struggles. The great political lesson of those struggles was that victory requires the leadership of a Marxist political party based on the working class and supported by democratic organs of working class power. That was the basis of the victory of the 1917 October Revolution. It was the absence of Marxist leadership due to the betrayals of Stalinism and social democracy that was principally responsible for the defeats suffered by the working class in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution. The culmination of those defeats, of those betrayals, was the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now, this was followed by 30 years of political confusion and disorientation. But the unresolved and insoluble contradictions of capitalism is setting into motion a new wave of revolutionary struggles. Within this process, events in the United States will play a central and decisive role. In the aftermath of the two devastating imperialist world wars of the 20th century, it was American capitalism that stabilized and rescued European and world capitalism. It will not be able to play that role in the revolutionary struggles that are now unfolding. The former stabilizer of world capitalism has now become the greatest source of global instability. Moreover, the politically conservative working class in the United States, supposedly immune to the appeal of socialism, is now being politically radicalized. Where is America going? The answer to this question is to socialism. The conditions now exist for an extraordinary advance in the political consciousness of the working class. Paradoxically, the same technological advance that poses an immense threat to its living conditions will also prove to be a powerful weapon in the development of revolutionary consciousness. The vast pedagogical potential of artificial, or one might say augmented intelligence, combined with the revolutionary perspectives of scientific socialism, open unprecedented possibilities. The consciousness of the working class, the understanding of the objective conditions of capitalist crisis, the clarification of the path to working class power, all of this can be spread on a scale that previous generations could scarcely have imagined. Just as Diderot's encyclopedia in the 18th century became an instrument for enlightenment that contributed to the French Revolution by making knowledge available to masses of people who had been kept in ignorance, so artificial intelligence, properly developed and democratically controlled, utilized by the revolutionary Marxist Trotskyist Party and placed in the service of the working class rather than capitalist profit, can become an instrument of socialist consciousness. Now, the World Socialist Web Site has long recognized this potential. And I'm pleased to announce today that the International Committee has taken measures to harness the power of AI for the purposes and interests of the working class movement. Within a few weeks, we will be releasing Socialism AI, a revolutionary application of augmented intelligence to the development of socialist consciousness and the organizational capacity of the international working class. It is a chatbot which will enable users to pose political, historical, social questions, problems of organization, tactical initiative, and receive a response which draws on the vast archive of Marxist thought. First and foremost, the archive of the World Socialist Web Site itself, which encompasses well over 100,000 articles. It will access vast portions of the archive of Marxist thought, the best works of historical literature. And it will not be programmed, as the existing chatbots are, to provide an answer which has been conditioned by the establishment media. It will provide an accurate, thoroughly researched reply to critical issues which arise in the day-to-day struggles of the working class. It will answer questions posed by intellectuals, students, youth, on a vast range of questions. And it will be answers which reflect and express the interests of the working class. This is not a minor technical project. Some 28 years ago, when the internet was first coming into existence, we understood the power of this new technology, and we were the first, not only left-wing, first left-wing publication, left-wing tendency, to actually make the shift from a written newspaper to the internet. We founded the World Socialist Web Site. At that time, it was so new, I recently checked this, that Amazon only had about 850 employees. We understood the implications of this technology and acted upon it. And this was critical for the development of the revolutionary movement. We understand the power of AI, both its reactionary, but also its revolutionary potential. We are acting on the latter. I'm convinced that in the weeks and months ahead, and even certainly in the years ahead, all of you will be using it. And thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of workers will utilize this powerful instrument as a means of education, social education, political education, cultural education. It will be used not in one language, but in dozens of languages. As a matter of fact, when it is unveiled, it will be available within a few weeks here in Germany, and you will be able to use it in the German language, French language, Italian language, Russian, whatever. Just as the World Socialist Web Site today is published in 15 languages. This application of the most advanced productive forces to the transformation of consciousness has vast significance. It makes available instantly and globally the theoretical resources, the historical analysis, the programmatic clarity necessary for the working class to understand its historic mission and seize power. Now, we embarked upon this project actually almost a year ago. Our technical team has been working on it assiduously. And this decision to expand, to make use of AI, and to devote considerable resources to its development is based on a political perspective. It's not to amuse ourselves. We deeply believe that objective conditions all over the world is generating a revolutionary movement. We saw this phenomenon emerge in the first half of the 20th century. The problems of that century were not solved, but they demonstrated the possibility of their resolution. The same questions that gave rise to revolutions in the 20th century are now re-emerging with far greater force in the 21st. The world in which we live is like a dormant volcano upon whose slope civilization builds its monuments, establishes its institutions, and organizes its daily life. For long periods of time, the volcano remains dormant. But beneath the surface, immense pressures accumulate. The magma rises, the tremors intensify, and finally the eruption comes with catastrophic force, transforming the landscape entirely. The metaphor of the volcano captures not only the destructive, but also the creative energy of this process. A volcanic eruption destroys the old terrain, but creates new and very fertile land for development. The eruption of class struggle in the United States will destroy the rotting structures of capitalism, but will also open the possibility of a new world. From the depth of social oppression will arise a force greater than any army or corporation, the collective power of a class that produces all wealth, yet owns nothing, literally. When that force acts consciously, guided by scientific socialism and the analysis of objective reality, it will sweep away the barriers of nationality and ethnicity and unite humanity in a common struggle for liberation. Thank you very much.